Hello and good morning, and welcome to Miss Theresa Ramsay's senior thesis oration. Senior theses come about in a variety of ways. In the case of Miss Ramsay, it came about through her junior author project, but in a circuitous manner. As you can tell from the description of her oration, she will be talking quite a bit about Machiavelli, but Machiavelli was not her junior author. The other great author mentioned in her summary introduction to her oration, Petrarch was her junior author. And so when Miss Ramsay and I started having conversations about her senior thesis project, she was very interested in the question of what the Italian Renaissance humanists, such as Petrarch, stood for, their political teaching, the relation between their understanding of rhetoric and their understanding of politics, and especially as she came to read Machiavelli in the previous semester before the junior author project, their relation to Machiavelli. In particular, she read a work by the great contemporary Harvard Renaissance historian James Hankins called Virtue, Politics.
Statecraft and Soulcraft in Renaissance Italy.
Statecraft and Soulcraft in Renaissance Italy. And so she became very interested in the relation between Petrarch and the humanism that he stood for, and the subsequent developments epitomized by Machiavelli. And over the course of the thesis project, I pushed her to become more Machiavelli. That's quite the way I want to put it, but to speak more directly and more fully about Machiavelli, until lo and behold, it sort of became a Machiavelli project in conversation with and with Petrarch sort of in the background. And what she has done for her oration is put the two great figures next to each other, grabbing onto the final lines of Machiavelli's Prince, where he quotes Petrarch. Miss Ramsay has some very interesting things to point out to us about that quotation at the end, how that becomes a kind of entry into Machiavelli's Prince and in the Machiavellian project more fully. So please join me in welcoming Miss Theresa Ramsay for her oration titled A Poet, Philosopher, or Prophet?
Thank you, Dr. Papadopoulos, for all your help with the thesis writing process, as well as the oration. And thank you, Dr. Tomkowitz, for your helpful notes. And thank you, Dr. Virginia, as well, for being my third name. I wanted to open with a prayer by Machiavelli, but then I found the listing of his prayers and decided against it. For that reason, I'm going to ask another Italian for his intercession. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Angel of schools at the bidding of Peter, thousands today are saluting thee thus. We too are claiming thy care and thy counsel, angel of schools, being angel to us. Come to our aid when thou hearest us calling, light up the dark, make the rough places plain. Bring to our thoughts the unknown or forgotten, give us the words of the seek for. In thy name. Amen. My appreciation for Petrarch has enough of a reputation that people will often come to me with different quotations that they found referencing Petrarch from their school readings, or if Petrarch comes up in class, they'll also let me know. This also happened in sophomore year. A junior came up to me and showed me in her reading how the letter that they were reading alongside Machiavelli's The Prince talks about Machiavelli going out into the Italian countryside with a book of poetry in his pocket. Dante, or Petrarch, or one of the other guys. It's not surprising that Machiavelli read Petrarch, considering that he is one of, if not the most influential Italian poet. What is surprising, and what definitely surprised me, is his use of Petrarch. As Dr. Papadopoulos pointed out in my introduction, Machiavelli concludes The Prince using lines from Petrarch. This isn't the only instance he uses Petrarch, though. Also, in his exhortation to penitence, an oration that he gave likely to a religious confraternity in Florence, Italy. Then he also concludes with lines from Petrarch. This really stood out to me. When he quotes Petrarch as a moral voice in this instance. He tells his audience that they must repent for their sins. They must cry out for mercy with King David and weep out guilt with St. Peter. And then he says, repent and understand clearly that as much as pleases the world is a short dream. Those lines aren't introduced as if they are Petrarch's, but they are. They come from one of his canzoniere poems. It's an interesting combination as well. It's King David, beloved of God, St. Peter, the first pope, and Francesco Petrarch, the father of Renaissance humanism. I believe that Machiavelli's use of Petrarch is indicative of his broader mission and his understanding of language as a means of power. And there's the way I'd like to explore this is first looking at particular differences within the canzone that Machiavelli selectively quotes from. If you look on your handout, just a quick explanation of that piece of paper you've been given, or two pieces of paper if you're extra special. If you see on one side, I have given you the whole canzone. I try and live by WWMD. What wouldn't Machiavelli do? He would not give you the full canzone. So please appreciate you have the full canzone. It might be hard to read it while someone's up here jabbering. But if you want to, then it's fully there. And then on the left-hand side, you can see A, B, and C. Those are the main sections I'm going to be examining. I also have a bolded portion. That bolded portion, which is also on the bottom right, that is the actual quotation that he uses, the actual line that he uses to conclude the prints. So I have the De Alvarez translation, which is the one I primarily used for my thesis, as well as the Journaling version, which is the translation I use for the canzone. So the majority of my oration will talk about those 3 points. But then I would also like to look at the philosophical differences between Petrarch and Machiavelli, just to understand where the particular differences might have come from when we examine that canzone. And lastly, I'd like to answer the question. When Machiavelli goes out to the countryside, why does he keep a poet in his pocket, and why specifically would he choose Petrarch? A quick explanation of the canzone. The canzone is the 128th poem of a collection of loosely related poems called Petrarch's Rime Sparse, or his canzoniere. A singular one is called the canzone, not to be confused with calzone, but we'll be primarily looking just at that one. All right, with that, let's jump in. Petrarch says, and this is actually, a quick side note, this is actually directed at the noble Italians during Petrarch's time. So they were caught up in pay conflicts with each other while foreign forces were encroaching on Italian territory. So Petrarch wrote this poem. It was very politically motivated, even though lots of the canzoniere are love poems or other fluffier material. This one is very political. This portion here is directed at God within the framework of the full poem, which is directed at the noble lords. See, noble lord, from what trivial causes comes such cruel war. The hearts that proud fierce Mars makes hard and closed, Father, do you open and soften and free. Cause your truth, though I am unworthy, to be heard there through my tongue. The main thing that I want us to take away from this portion of the canzone is the fact that the power of truth is God's within the Petrarchan model. He says that it's God's truth that he wants to communicate. And in addition to that, the very ability that he might have to communicate that truth is dependent upon God's grace. He's calling out to God, asking him to give him the grace in order to communicate truth in a way that people can hear it, understand it, and be moved by it. This doesn't work really within a Machiavellian framework. Machiavelli says that he writes the prince to write a useful thing for him who understands. The prince is meant to be useful. It has a utilitarian end. This is especially shown in Machiavelli's understanding of effectual truth and his desire to bring an effectual truth to the prince. He says, it seemed to be more profitable to go behind to the effectual truth of the thing than to the imagination thereof. Machiavelli says that he's not going to talk in pictures. He doesn't care so much about imagination. He doesn't care, it seems, about the things that poetry deals with, which is just image, and which is more so about imagination than it is about anything effectual. In addition, Machiavelli thinks that knowledge of effectual truth can actually grant a person power. And we can see this in the fact that despite this being a useful work, and despite its only grace, he says, coming from the fact that it is a useful work, Machiavelli does throw in a couple poetic devices. He uses imagery, and he also uses repetition. We can see this in quote 1. He says, this work I have not ornamented, either with the fullness of extended clauses, or with pompous and magnificent words, or with whatever artifices or extrinsic ornaments with which they most usually describe and ornament their things. End quote. I've underlined this just in case you missed this. But Machiavelli uses ornament 3 different times, different ways as well. Machiavelli is using repetition in order to get his point across, despite saying that the only grace in this work is going to be in its utility. When it comes to an understanding of ornaments, this also can reveal a bit of something about what Machiavelli thinks that effectual truth can do. De Alvarez says that ornaments for Machiavelli are tokens of a self-sufficient plenitude. What does that mean? Well, if you eat icing without cake, there might be something wrong with you. This is sort of what De Alvarez is pointing out. If you're talking about ornaments, then that's something extra that goes on top of necessity. You need the cake in order to have the icing. On the other hand, the magnificent, and the person who this work was directed towards, Lorenzo, actually had the epithet, the magnificent Lorenzo. The magnificent, on the other hand, De Alvarez also says, display their freedom from necessity by their love of the beautiful. Because magnificent people have cake, they're allowed to enjoy icing. They can actually enjoy ornaments in ways that people who are stuck at the level of necessity cannot. However, we see something a bit interesting when Machiavelli is offering a useful work to somebody who is supposedly magnificent. He says that from his perspective, in a lower social position than the prince, he actually has a unique perspective which makes him more useful and makes his work more useful to the prince. He uses the analogy, an image, of a person in the valley as opposed to a person in the mountain. He says that a person in the mountain might be able to say things well about people in the valley from their perspective. But from the valley, Machiavelli says that he can also bring useful information to the prince because he has a clearer picture of what the prince is than the prince himself does. And we can see this in quote 2. The prince, therefore, does not know well the nature of princes, which is to say, he does not know himself. What the prince does not know, then, is how to rule. For not to know how princes act is not to know how to rule. End quote. So what's just happened? Machiavelli, it seems, is saying that he has something the prince does not. He switched roles with the prince. Machiavelli is the magnificent one and not the prince, because the prince actually requires something from Machiavelli that only Machiavelli can give him. He has traded places. Truth for Machiavelli is very different than it is for Petrarch. Harvey Mansfield also points this out. He says Machiavelli's truth is in the effectual truth, the truth shown in the outcome of his thoughts. Machiavelli is truly result-oriented in this regard. Petrarch, on the other hand, realizes that any results that come about are going to be through God's grace. Very different. Let's move on to section B. In this section, I'd really like to focus on the idea of piety and virtue. Now, Machiavelli does something surprisingly Shockingly, he does something a bit sneaky. The quotation that he ends the prince with is very selectively cut. He starts it off with the word manhood or virtue. Just etymologically, they both come from the Latin word vir, and so both of them have very similar meanings. But when Machiavelli cuts his quotation, he cuts out the lead up, which tells you how virtue or how manhood ought to be framed. He begins, manhood shall take up arms, but the full section, as you can tell, begins by reference to God. It begins, by God, let this sometimes move your minds, and with pity look on the tears of the sorrowing people, who only from you, after God, can hope for peace. And if you merely show some sign of piety, manhood shall take up arms against rage, and the fighting shall be short, for ancient valor is not yet dead in italic hearts. For Petrarch, virtue is very much rooted in piety. You'll recall that Machiavelli used Petrarch as a moral voice in Exhortations to Penitence, and there's a good reason why he did that. Petrarch was a moral writer. We can see this in Petrarch's contribution to the Mirror Prince genre. Now, this genre essentially is one in which the Renaissance authors would often engage in, and they would tell a prince how they ought to act and how they ought to rule. Usually there's going to be a very large emphasis on virtue, and for Petrarch, this was definitely the case. He wrote his own Lives of Illustrious Men, which very much focused on the best type of men that people should imitate. The Prince is a perversion, if you will, of this sort of genre. Petrarch wouldn't just write about this sort of thing, though. He would actually take golden coins, embossed with the figures or the faces of truly remarkable, virtuous men, and he would give those coins to different statesmen in order to give somebody a tangible token of the type of person that they should be emulating. Machiavelli does something a little bit similar, but also switches it around. Machiavelli says that princes should imitate not just the great men, but actually the most excellent. And the reason why he says that is it looks like so that way you can fall short of that ideal. Let's turn to quote 3. When it comes to most excellent men, he says, if your virtue does not reach up to there, at least it gives some odor of it. And to do as prudent archers do, who when the target they purpose to strike appears very far off, and knowing nicely how much the virtue of their bow can do, they place their aim much higher than the intended target, not to reach such a height with their arrow, but so they may, by aid of so high an aim, attain their purpose. End quote. You might notice something interesting there, and if you didn't, I underlined it as well. The first time he talks about virtue, he's talking about the virtue of the man reading the prince. It's your virtue. The second time he uses the word virtue, he's talking about the virtue of a bow. These two are seemingly very different things. Machiavelli has used the image of a bow, and then midway through the analogy, he switches up what he's talking about. It's not virtue of a man anymore, it's virtue of a bow, which is going to be a very different thing. Machiavelli has removed the space for piety within his understanding of virtue. Petrarch talks about how if you are moved by piety, then your virtue should take up arms, then your manhood should take up arms. Machiavelli doesn't leave space for this. And we can especially see this in his depiction and anthropomorphization of virtue and fortune. He makes virtue a strictly masculine thing, a male thing. And then leaning into this binary, he says that fortune, on the other hand, is a woman. When he has this very strict binary, then it definitely does seem as though you have to choose one or the other, fortune or virtue in a very masculine and removed from a Christian sense of piety in that sort of sense. Now, within a Christian framework, then fortune is really just another word for God's providence. And so you should be able to have both virtue and also be able to operate within what fortune has given to you. This is not so for Machiavelli. He uses the analogy of fortune being like a woman to say that the way she must be maintained or taken care of is to be beaten. Distasteful, sure, but it definitely shows why it's important that he has this dichotomy between fortune as feminine and virtue as masculine. There is no room for Christian piety, where you just look at fortune as another word for God's providence. Which shows us something which we can explore better in the third section. Section C. Petrarch tells his audience, as you pass through this valley, let it please you to conquer hatred and anger, winds contrary to a tranquil life, and that time which you now spend in giving others pain, let it be converted to some more worthy action of hand or intellect, to some lovely praise, to some virtuous study. Thus, down here, one may be happy and find open the road to heaven. When I was examining Machiavelli's different prayers, I actually found a line in which he told a friend in a letter. He said, if you want to find the road to heaven, the most effective way to do that would be to find the road to hell and then just not go that way. That in itself is very different from Machiavelli versus Petrarch. Petrarch wants you to engage in virtuous study. He was a huge proponent of the liberal arts and also a supporter of a return to the classics. Petrarch very much wanted people to engage in their humanity, and part of that is in developing their intellect. Machiavelli, on the other hand, allows for moral archery. He's got a different perspective of what types of virtues or what types of people he wants to develop. He, for instance, doesn't encourage prudence in a typical classical Aristotelian sense. Using quote 4, I'm not going to quote it exactly, but you have the full quote. He says that virtue makes the target correct, and it is only when the target is a noble one that the cleverness is praiseworthy. But base is mere cunning. And something Aristotle says that is even more condemnatory of Machiavelli's depiction of prudence is the fact that Aristotle also says that it is manifest, that it is impossible for someone who is not good to be prudent. Machiavelli says that princes cannot observe all those things by which men are held to be good. So his depiction of prudence is not real prudence at all. It's just appearing to be good. In no way is Machiavelli focusing on human excellence. Instead, he says that a prince should be like a fox to know snares and a lion to terrify wolves. These are both very animalistic images, and that's what he's trying to encourage in his audience. He also says that Chiron, the centaur, who is half beast, half animal, is an emblematic political teacher. This is not about human excellence. This is not about human virtue. This is not about finding the way to heaven by improving yourself as a human being. So what's going on? We've looked at a lot of particular differences between the two. Let's step away from the canzone for a bit and try and understand the philosophical disagreements between Petrarch and Machiavelli. Charles Trinkhaus, a literary scholar, says that Petrarch's great achievement was that he realized poetic objectivity through the medium of subjective experience. What does that mean? I think a useful way of explaining this is considering one of Petrarch's more famous works, his Sacred Tome. This work, Petrarch actually resurrects the dialogue form from the classical and patristic period. And he puts himself as a character, Petrarchus, in conversation with St. Augustinus. Now, these two talk for days, and the main goal of their conversation is to try and pull Petrarch away from his soul being caught up in earthly things, being too distracted to really consider God and transcendent reality. And the conversation lasts for days. Before it happens, however, Lady Truth appears to Petrarch, and they actually have a conversation of their own, which Petrarch doesn't even record. So even though Petrarch has an objective understanding of reality, an objective understanding of truth, where truth can be personified, come and appear to you and talk to you, even though that is there, then what Petrarch is actually going to record is the conversation held between two mortals, in which he quotes poetry, he uses examples. It's all very much based in people's experiences. It is about the conversation that mortals can have. This also shows us another thing about Petrarch, which is that he believes that philosophy ought to be ordered to virtue. And we can see this in quote 6, also by Trinkhaus. Essentially, however, Petrarch's inclination was to value philosophy primarily for its contribution to the strengthening of human virtue. Lady Truth is Lady Philosophy's sister, and so she can appear to Petrarch. But the reason why she does so is to try and improve his chances at getting to heaven, trying to actually make him a better person and willing to engage in the hard work of becoming more virtuous. He does have a value for philosophy, though. It's just an ordered valuation of philosophy. Machiavelli is opposed to this. He's not about virtuous study. He's not about really improving your intellect according to higher truths. In no way is the Prince written to communicate truth, as I've already spoken about. He also, though, in Florentine histories, he gives an example of Cato expelling the philosophers from Rome, and he really puts this into a positive light. He says, in quote 7, "For as good and orderly armies give birth to victories, and victories to quiet, the strength of well-armed spirits cannot be corrupted by a more honorable leisure than that of letters. Nor can leisure enter into well-instituted cities with a greater and more dangerous deceit than this one." This was best understood by Cato, when the philosophers Diogenes and Carneades, sent by Athens as spokesmen to the Senate, came to Rome. When he saw how the Roman youth was beginning to follow them around with admiration, and since he recognized the evil that could result to his fatherland from this honorable leisure, he saw to it that no philosopher could be accepted in Rome. Machiavelli sees philosophy as dangerous because it might make people more effeminate. He is not about developing the intellect, if developing the intellect means that your muscles atrophy, essentially. So, if they are so philosophically opposed, then why does Machiavelli keep Petrarch in his pocket? I think the reason why he does so is because Petrarch can be quite easily confused for a prophet. Poetry can read like prophecy. And he actually gives an example of just this happening in one of his letters. He tells about how an Italian statesman read a small portion of one of Petrarch's canzones. And after he read that small section, he decided that the full canzone, which was talking about the refounding of Rome, was directed at him specifically. He read it as if it was prophecy. We see this in quote 8. "It was known to Messer Stefano that poets many times are full of divine and prophetic spirit, so that he judged in every mode those things which Petrarch had prophesied in that canzone would come to pass, and that he would be the one who would be the executor of so glorious an enterprise." Machiavelli has a very interesting presentation of prophets. He uses the examples of Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus as truly paradigmatic figures when it comes to being prophets. Quote 9, he says, and this is referring to these figures, "And it is therefore necessary to examine whether these innovators stand on their own or if they depend on others. That is to say, whether they conduct their work they need to beg or are truly able to force. In the first case, they always come to evil and lead to nothing. But when they depend on their own and are able to force, then there is rarely a time that they are endangered, whence it comes to pass that all armed prophets conquer and the unarmed ones are ruined." Throughout The Prince, and throughout a lot of Machiavelli's work, then we see a blending of political power with ecclesiastical power. For instance, in chapter 11 of The Prince, he says that He's not going to talk as much about ecclesiastical states or how they hold power because they stand by a superior cause, the superiority of which causes the human mind cannot grasp. He says he can't really talk about ecclesiastical states because there's something special going on. But then in his other work, or one of his other works, Discourses on Livy, he brings up the example of St. Dominic and St. Francis. He says that they returned the church to strength by bringing it back to its beginnings. This is interesting because this is the same way he says that normal states, temporal states, republics can also regain strength by returning to their beginnings. In the end, spiritual power for Machiavelli is not superior cause. It's just dressed up or ornamented temporal power, and that's what gives it strength. That's why Machiavelli keeps Petrarch in his pocket. His power is in his weaponization of poetry. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Ramsay. We're going to have questions from the faculty panel before we open it up to the full audience, and I'll let my colleagues have the first shot. Whichever.
And we get the odor of it.
Yeah.
It's synesthesia there. It's interesting. So now I feel justified in writing 6 letters of recommendation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Theresa. I learned so much. I didn't know all these connections with Petrarch. I'm very, very grateful for them. And I think you might have a book there or something someday. So stay with it. But what I wanted to ask of several layers here, the imagined republics that he's talking about, that you referred to, it's not about poetry, it's about philosophy. He's not talking about poets. He's talking, that's a philosophic dig. And in fact, he was very reliant on the poetic mode as another angle, one could say, for his own teaching. As you know, you've read Mandragola, he has Clizia, he has quite a few outrageous plays, right, which seem to, when we analyze them, incorporate the flesh to the teachings of the prince. So I wonder if part of his armor, if you consider him as a kind of prophet at the end of the prince, part of his armor, just as he uses Petrarch, is to use poetry in order to move Italy in the direction he has in mind. And beyond that, is it possible for him, is it possible to think about poetry in the way that he talks about armed and unarmed prophets? Is that kind of an armor for the many, as it were, right? I mean, he reads the philosophy, he reads the poetry, he does all that, is in that letter to Vittori, but is the other kind, that he would use perhaps more effectively, part of his superlative, part of his, equipment, is that is that for the many? Is that, or what would you say? Or is it for his own delight? Does he just do it as entertainment for himself?
Yeah, so first I'd like to focus on what he said near the beginning, which is the difference between philosophy and poetry, and about how I'm not talking about the imagination thereof, is more about philosophy. I mean, that makes sense considering the imagined cities that we see in classical political writers. Yeah, exactly. And so the thing is, though, that when the specific thing that I quote when I talk about the imagination thereof, then it is being put in contradiction to effectual truth. And something de Alvarez notes is that Machiavelli doesn't really see images as capable of forming the soul. They're more capable for inspiring passion. And so you're going to have reality mediated by images. But for Machiavelli, then the poetry is actually, it happens at the level of emotions. And so I think that is why it is able to be a weapon. I don't think it's so much an armor for the many as a means of engaging with the many, and a means of awakening passion. But it's not about forming the soul in any way. Whereas for Petrarch, when he uses imagery, it's because he's trying to bring the soul's attention to something and really make a person aware of their faults and how that is going to bring them away from the path to heaven.
So, but if you're forming the soul to answer to the passions instead of the true prudence, you're forming the soul. I mean, he's still forming the soul.
He never mentions his soul.
He doesn't need to. Why should he? No, he doesn't. All through there, he doesn't. Yeah. I think that would be to take away his cover. You know?
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and definitely actions do form the soul. But for Machiavelli, he's really just trying to bring attention away from that and trying to look at just actions, just as they might be motivated by passion. And so poetry is useful in that it operates at the level of judgment. It does mediate reality, and so that's what you're seeing, and that's going to be able to motivate people to action. But I don't think he's trying to look at a higher truth or trying to.
Oh, I agree. So does he use scripture similarly to how he uses poetry?
Yes.
Why?
Because ecclesiastical power and temporal power can be blended together so easily.
Can you give me some examples? You use David, for instance.
Yes. King David was called to penitence, and that was really more about his actions as opposed to who he was.
Is he armed?
Yes, he used deceit in order to gain Bathsheba, which is the specific
Well, I mean, against
example.
Goliath, what arms him against?
Oh, and Goliath?
Yeah.
A stone and sling.
So is there a teaching in that?
I can't recall him specifically speaking about that as much as speaking about David's actions in regards to Bathsheba. So, but yeah, definitely with that you could say David was, even though he did a temporal action, he killed the champion. That temporal action granted him ecclesiastical power, and as the king of the Jews, the chosen people of Israel, then it was both an ecclesiastical state and a temporal state.
And what about Moses?
Moses he
Killed infinite men. That's his line. Sorry.
Yeah. We get excited about Machiavelli.
What was your question about Moses? What did you
So
mean?
the
What about
armed
Moses?
and unarmed prophets, the way he uses Moses in reference to Cyrus and Theseus and Romulus. So if Moses, who we think of as following God's voice, is understood as the one who achieved his ends himself, how did he do it himself?
because people knew that he had God's voice.
Did he?
Did he? Yeah.
Machiavelli?
That's questionable.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I think Machiavelli probably did, but he was just looking, not super interested in what was really going on, as opposed to what
Doesn't he make an analogy between himself and Moses?
Yeah, and I think the Holy Prince in a way is doing that. He is saying that he is a prophet. He is saying that he is able to institute a new order.
But he needs scripture, which gives us images, and he needs poetry, which gives us images in order to effectually support his claim.
Mm-hmm.
And that's for the many who are still believers.
Okay, many versus you. It's for the one who understands.
For the
So
one who-
probably many will not understand,
Okay.
and in which case it is for whoever does understand.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Thank you very much, Theresa. I know of your interest in modern American politics and public policy and so on. And in a review I read about, what's his name, Hankins' book, the reviewer was kind of saying, he didn't quite put it in these terms, but he was almost saying, this book might be required reading for like everybody interested in politics on both sides of the aisle. Where are we, and which might be a great idea, but is Machiavelli essentially correct about successful politics? Given a Machiavellian and Petrarchian, who wins?
Petrarch did fail. He was absolutely, he failed. He was absolutely wonderful, beautiful poet. He has revolutionized the sonnet, like we wouldn't have Shakespeare without Petrarch, but he actually was so disenchanted with politics after like a big push for one political figure, and that big push failed. Then Petrarch really did just give coins out. So I think there is a healthy medium. I don't think that Petrarch did have really an ideal mode of going about it, but Petrarch didn't. Hankins makes a distinction between a polytoema, sorry, Dr. Papadopoulos, and polytoema and a padeteuma. Essentially, Petrarch really focused on trying to inculcate virtue in people who were going to become leaders. And so that was the way that Petrarch thought that you could have politically, like good politics, is sort of downstream of education. So, I mean, hopefully there is some truth there. Otherwise, this institution is not really helping America. But it wasn't a very active political role. It was just trying to inculcate virtue in people who were willing to take on the active role. And so I think there is some truth to be said in that, yeah, we want people to be developed in virtue. We want them to develop their intellects to try and gain human excellence. But there's very different duties in forming people's intellect and forming an educational model like Petrarch was engaged in, as opposed to engaging in politics.
Could I follow up on that? When you read the first paragraph of chapter 15 of The Prince, or when I read it, the impression I come away with is that Machiavelli has established a dichotomy between beautiful but ineffective types of people and effective but sort of dirty-based people. And I suppose your answer to Dr. Tonkowicz and also some things in your presentation made me think that you've described Petrarch as a beautiful but ineffective person and Machiavelli as an evil but effective person. I guess my first question is that accurate? I'm using beautiful interchangeable with noble, virtuous in that sense of virtuous.
Right. I don't think it's fully correct, because Machiavelli, even though his focus is on efficacy, he was pointing out lots of the things that he brings up, or examples he brings up, he really twisted about in ways, like for instance, the Navis example. He uses Navis, let's go with that. He uses him as a sort of character worthy of imitation, and sort of drops the fact that he was murdered because he was a tyrant, assassinated. And so Machiavelli is focused on efficacy, but the only way he's able to do that is by dropping out portions of reality that are there, or ignoring aspects of history. And so even though he does have a goal of efficacy, it's not real. And so just as Petrarch might have been perhaps overly focused on the beauty and the noble, then he also did so in order to try and have people strive towards that, whereas Machiavelli is going to focus more on the bad, or focus more on the efficacious, and that also gives him a limited picture of reality. So both of them have limited pictures of reality. I think that Petrarch would be the better model to follow if you have to pick one between the two, because his model of reality is striving towards the best.
That seems like a safe answer or an accurate answer, that if you have to err in one direction, it might be better to err on the side of being a Petrarchan martyr than an effective.
He wasn't a martyr.
Who winds up in hell. No, but if you follow these sort of two systems of always doing the right thing, but almost to the exclusion of efficacy in this world, as opposed to being willing to do anything in order to be effective for the goals that you're. But okay, so you've You agree that both seem to be inadequate. You mentioned several times Petrarch's desire to recover antiquity. Could you say something about Machiavelli's attempt to do so?
Yeah, so Petrarch actually had more rose-colored glasses, I think, than Machiavelli when it came to antiquity. Machiavelli says in discourses that people use antiquity more so because there aren't passions that are going to be inflamed right away. You don't really care about what something that happened at an emotional level, something that happened 500 years ago. And that's why it can be useful to use ancient examples as opposed to modern examples. But Machiavelli didn't actually think that ancients were any better than the moderns.
Wait, explain that last comment. Is it?
He didn't think that, well, okay, better might be the wrong word, but he didn't think there was significant differences between modern like activities that are current with his day and activities that happened 5,000 years ago. He thought that it's just the perception was different between the two.
Yeah, okay, so it's not that men were moral in ancient times and are immoral now or something like that. He doesn't have rose-tinted glasses in that sense. But isn't a huge part of his project recovering his understanding of ancient virtue, of Roman virtue and strength, separating it from, in his interpretation, sort of the Christian effeminacy of antiquity that's characteristic of the Renaissance and maybe earlier periods as well. So that men can be good or virtuous or strong and effective again. It also, final just suggestion, chapter 14 of the Prince, right, coming right before 15, is a chapter on education.
Yeah.
And so Machiavelli's teaching is also downstream from education. And chapter 14 sounds like the most WCC education chapter. It's you need to go out and learn the ways of like the hills
Look at the
rise
hills that way
and
you
the
can
valleys.
imagine.
So you can imagine that, with your band of brothers, if the enemy was on that hill, how would you take it? Right, you need to sort of exercise in that way, and then you also need to read
So
the ancient
history.
examples, history
rather-
and the wilderness, actually. But of course, thinking about the wilderness in the sense of a terrain to be defended or conquered. I wonder if our institution is not so much Petrarchan, but closer to the mean between the two.
Petrarch went to a mountain. He said that, okay, he was wrong, but he said that he was the first person in since ancient times to actually climb a mountain just for the heck of it. So that's actually
Okay,
why
so-
I wrote
so
that in my
maybe-
application essay.
So maybe we climb it for the heck of it. Since we're here. Maybe I'll make this a suggestion instead of a description that maybe we should be more Machiavellian in our outdoor program. Anyway, I'll open it up.
Wait. Okay, is it possible that Machiavelli is the new Virgil? I mean, the other poet quoted in the poem is Virgil in the Aeneid when Dido says, difficult things make it impossible for me to be friendly, I must use force, because is he a new kind of founder of Rome? I mean, in this case, what we're talking about is somebody who's reimagining history in such a way that actively Italians will take another course than the Catholic Christendom one that has formed them. Is he like Virgil in that regard? Is he giving us a new poem in the Prince?
I mean, he wants to be, yeah. I think I'd be willing to grant that.
Did you think about that passage and that one?
I did a little bit. It was, to me, it wasn't super, the thing is, I was trying to more focus on his use of poetic devices to further rhetorical purposes or further persuasive purposes. And so I looked at that passage and didn't think all too much about it because
Well, but here's the thing, you can't have some of his teaching without the poets to play off of.
right, exactly.
And
But
so-
he seems to be using Virgil a bit differently in that he's not.
Mhm.
He seems to be using more as one would use a saying as opposed to poetry. I think there is less room to misinterpret that passage because it is just about difficult things. And it's not specific to the condition that Machiavelli is in. I thought put it in the same framework or understand in the same way as his use of Petrarch.
Let's open it up.
Dr. Zepeda.
Yeah, can you tell me more about what Machiavelli thinks a prophet is? Is a prophet one who sees truth and then reveals it to other people? What's a prophet?
No, not one who sees truth and reveals it. A prophet is one who is able to inspire passion and have a mode of persuading people. He gives the example of Don Savoltaro.
Savonarola.
The example of him. And he really brings up that he failed as a prophet because he would actually, like, yes, he'd persuade people, but they would never stick around. Their minds were eventually changed. Whereas prophets are armed. With his understanding of the prophet, in order to be effective, they have to be armed. So a prophet can be a person who just speaks effectual truth. It can be a person who just tries to persuade people. It can be Don S. It can be that person, but they're not going to be effective. What makes a prophet effective is to speak effectual truth, to be able to change people's minds, to be able to inspire passion, but also actually have arms behind it, have force behind it, have a way where people would actually hold and maintain the things that the prophet wants to be maintained. So in regards to Machiavelli, in my thesis, I a bit more presented him as a prophet because he's an innovator, because he's trying to bring about a new order and refound the ancient virtue which he thinks is lost. But I also talked about how he is armed and his use of language is his weapons. His words are his weapons.
So somewhere in the ethics, I don't remember the exact quote, Aristotle compares virtue to an archer who can hit his mark. Do you think, I'm looking at quote, the third quote on your handout, do you think Machiavelli was trying to draw that connection there, or am I just like reading something that's up there?
No, so actually the Aristotle quote that I use is immediately before. The target that he's talking about is actually in regards to an archer's target. So so Aristotle does use archer as well, and I think Machiavelli is referencing that. Yeah.
You read it.
He definitely read it.
It's in his library.
Oh, Bella. Claire's into that promote too.
I mean, obviously, he is kind of using this literary device in order to convince his readers. My question is, why would he be claiming otherwise? And does that also have to do with kind of the usefulness of his work to the prince? Or does it have to do with him kind of putting himself above the prince as knowing more than the prince does?
I think yes. Like I think he's doing multiple things. So one of them is what I talked about. He is switching roles with the prince. I focus more on the role of ornamentation and magnificence, but also he starts off the work by saying many people bring their gifts to one prince, and then again, as he's like painting this picture, this image, then he says that the person who brought the gift is the one, and compares it to plural people, the others. And so that's just another example of Machiavelli switching roles with the prince. So I think ornamentation is one way in which he does it, but through the use of ornamentation and presenting himself as magnificent in a way that the prince can't be if the prince is at the level of necessity. So that's one way. Also, when it comes to using literary devices, I think he is possibly trying to, I mean, there could be different things. He might be trying to have his audience let their guard down and not realize that he is actually going to use poetic devices in a way that is efficacious. Or it could just be him demonstrating that part of the way that this work can be read is not tongue-in-cheek, because that sounds nice and fun, but as a little bit, require a bit of fox and lion-like knowledge. Clara.
My question was just in relation to philosophy. Just when you talked about the philosophical differences and first talking about Trinkhaus, with Petrarch viewing philosophy as a tool in order to strengthen human virtue, but then in the following passage where Machiavelli says that philosophy is actually dangerous. Can you just compare those in more depth?
Yeah, I think the most helpful thing is to consider that Petrarch was striving for people to be the best human beings they could be as human beings, whereas Machiavelli was not trying to make people the best they could be as humans. And so I think that difference really helps understand the role of philosophy. Philosophy gets in the way if you're trying to encourage people to be more brutish, if you're trying to encourage brutish strength, philosophy gets in the way. If you're trying to have people develop in a way that makes them more virtuous, makes them holier, then philosophy actually works well within that framework.
Could I follow up on that? I guess I want to know what it means to be a good human being according to Petrarch, and how you would compare that understanding, as well as Machiavelli's, to, say, Aristotle.
Mm-hmm. So, quick note, Petrarch was, it would be unfair to call him anti-Aristotelian, which I did at one point call him. That's not really fair. He criticizes people. He says, like, all people do when you ask them a question is bring up the 5 syllables of Aristotle's name, which is 5 syllables in Latin. And that is Petrarch's critique, is that he thinks he's overvalued, especially considering he's a pagan author. But Petrarch really did value Cicero. And Petrarch's, actually, one of his problems with Aristotle wasn't so much that he thought Aristotle was saying bad things, it was that he didn't think that the ethics was rhetorically effective. He said that at the end of the ethics, then nobody's going to sit there and want to be virtuous. So Petrarch actually leaned a lot more on Cicero. He said that he loved Virgil as a brother, but Cicero as a father. And so that's a lot of where his view of virtue as having a sort of manly undercurrent comes from, is through the Ciceronian influence. So Petrarch, though, fits a lot more within a classical model. And so if you consider like the difference that there is, because there is some difference between Greek Aristotle's virtue and Cicero's virtue, Petrarch is very much more in line with that versus Machiavelli.
Yeah, I guess what I have in mind is the status of the active life in the sense of politics and statesmanship. And it seems that I think Aristotle and Cicero both succeed in this. I think they both succeed in showing the dignity of effective action for the common good, not in a Machiavellian sense severed from kind of broader moral standards, but actually through those. And it seems, at least the way that Aristotle argues it in the ethics and the politics, I think we could conclude that he's only able to do that and sort of uphold the nobility of the active life, actually getting things done for the good in this world, because he recognizes that it's second best to the contemplative life. I think there's a version of that in Cicero as well. The Dream of Scipio sort of comes to mind immediately. But I wonder if there's a kind of, as you were describing earlier, the deficiency, how Petrarch and Machiavelli both have a kind of deficiency. I wonder if we could recast that deficiency in relation to the nobility of political action, classically understood, rightly understood by the classics, not sort of the distortions from one or the other. As Machiavelli is insufficiently concerned with contemplation, right? Ornament, right? The ornamental is the beautiful. It's the thing that you just gaze at. It's not put to any use, but it's that kind of self-sufficient plenitude. You just look at it and you enjoy looking at it. Machiavelli may not give enough attention to the thing that's above action and above effectiveness, and therefore his praise of effectiveness and action is distorted and becomes amoral. Whereas my impression from what you said of Petrarch is that actually his deficiency might be that he gives too much attention to to the contemplative, in the sense of sort of the way you described him as philosophic.
Yeah.
It's sort of gazing at the truth and the beautiful, and then not being able to fully describe it. And
Yeah, I think that their perception of community might help though, because yes, there is some ways in which Petrarch might be sacrificing efficiency, but he does in section B that I read from, he does talk about how piety and pity, the same word in Italian, should actually be what's inspiring the princes to take up arms in order to protect Italy. For Machiavelli in chapter 8, we see this view of Caesar Borgia actually bringing a community together through cruelty. And so that's the basis of community. And so it seems like there's a lot less room for, I don't know, a good active life. I don't think there's actually room for a good active life in Machiavelli, whereas there is room in Petrarch, even if it might be less effective in some areas. If you have a sense of piety and love of brother, then that is going to inspire you to take up arms, or it should for Petrarch.
yeah, and if again, I just don't know enough about Petrarch, but if he's a good Ciceronian, that would make sense to me, because Cicero and De Officiis just are used throughout that there's never any conflict, real conflict between the honorable and the useful. It's they're always apparent conflicts.
And that's why I think Durling chooses to translate from manhood. Like Mansfield really does emphasize the Ciceronian aspect of virtue for Petrarch, and which is why Machiavelli is able to co-opt it, because of the masculine undertones.
Probably one more question.
Margaret Mary?
What is human excellence for Machiavelli? Because if I remember correctly, he talked about the happiness of the prince as being able to secure your state and have the power to secure your state. But Machiavelli himself isn't quite doing that. Like, what is he trying to do? What is his happiness?
Yeah, so I think Machiavelli isn't so different from, like, Machiavelli is switching roles with the prince. And so I think his happiness should be considered as pretty similar as the type of happiness he's trying to inculcate in his audience. Or at least the way he presents himself, that's the way he wants it to be seen. Considering that he uses, I think, he is trying to be a prophet and also has arms. And so human happiness for him, human excellence, is not going to be a development of the intellect. There won't be philosophy. And it is going to be an encouragement of not virtue as manhood, even as much as virtue as force. And so the virtue as force is something that is brutal. It is something that is animalistic. And that's why he says that you should be like a fox to know snares and a lion to terrify wolves. That's why he brings up, as I said in my oration, Chiron as an emblematic teacher of political teachings, because he is half man, half animal. So for Machiavelli, human excellence is not the excellence princes should be after. Like, princely excellence would be something like chironic.
Well, does I guess a way of taking up Margaret Mary's question is, so Chiron was the preceptor to Achilles, right? Does which is the more complete excellence? Achilles, in Machiavelli's understanding, Achilles or Chiron? And which one is Machiavelli trying to become?
Oh, that'd be interesting. Okay,
Yeah.
In which case Machiavelli would be Chiron.
Yeah, the teacher.
And is trying to have Achilles, who is in touch with his animal side. Violence.
And on that note, thank you.